June 19, 1944, 10:36 hours, USS Lexington, Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu climbed into the cockpit of his F-6F-3 Hellcat, watching something through the morning haze that made no sense according to everything he understood about Japanese naval aviation. Radar had detected them 40 minutes earlier, a large formation approaching from the west at 18,000 feet. Fighter Director had been tracking them on radar scope, providing continuous updates on heading, altitude and composition. 60 to 70 aircraft, steady course, no evasive maneuvering, flying straight toward the most heavily defended naval force ever assembled. Through binoculars from the carrier deck, Vraciu could see them now, dark specks against the western sky growing larger as they approached. But something was wrong with their formation. Even at this distance, even to naked eye, the formation looked ragged. Aircraft were bunched together rather than properly spaced. Altitude discipline was poor, with planes scattered across several thousand feet rather than maintaining tactical separation. The approach pattern suggested disorganization rather than the precise coordination Japanese naval aviation had demonstrated throughout the war. Vraciu had fought Japanese pilots before, at Marcus Island, at Wake, over Kwajalein. He knew what their formations looked like: tight, disciplined, coordinated. What he was watching didn't match that standard. It looked like a training exercise gone wrong, like student pilots attempting maneuvers they hadn't adequately practiced. Think about that moment. The largest carrier battle in history was beginning. Japanese naval aviation was launching Operation Ago, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power and turn the tide of the Pacific War. And the pilots executing this critical operation were flying in formations that looked like amateur hour. What Vraciu didn't know as his Hellcat's engine roared to life was that he was about to participate in the most one-sided aerial slaughter in military history. That, in the next 8 hours, Japanese naval aviation would effectively cease to exist as offensive force. That he himself would shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, victims so poorly trained they would fly straight and level while he maneuvered into firing position and killed them one by one. What Vraciu didn't know was that the Japanese pilots approaching Task Force 58 were products of training system collapse so complete that it had transformed Japanese naval aviation from the world's most elite force into a collection of inadequately trained replacements being sent to die against enemies they had no capability to fight effectively. That many pilots in the formations he was watching had fewer than 100 hours total flight time, less than American pilots received before even beginning operational training. That some had never fired their guns in flight, that others had never practiced carrier landings until their first combat deployment. What Vraciu didn't know was the Japanese training system had entered death spiral where combat losses exceeded replacement capacity, forcing Japan to deploy pilots with progressively less training who died even faster, requiring even more poorly trained replacements in accelerating cycle that would culminate that morning in systematic execution disguised as aerial combat. What Vraciu didn't know was that among the pilots approaching in those ragged formations was Ensign Takeshi Maeda, age 19, who had received 6 months training, including 120 hours flight time, before deploying to carrier Zuikaku 3 weeks earlier. That Maeda's training had included perhaps 100 rounds of gunnery practice, barely enough to learn how his guns worked, nowhere near enough to achieve combat proficiency. That Maeda had practiced carrier landings approximately 20 times before his first combat deployment. That Maeda and most pilots in his squadron knew they were inadequately trained, but flew anyway because the Emperor commanded it, and because refusing would dishonor their families. What Vraciu didn't know was that Japanese squadron leaders had protested the mission that morning, telling Admiral Ozawa that their pilots weren't ready for combat against American defenses, but that Ozawa had no choice because Combined Fleet Headquarters demanded decisive battle regardless of pilot quality concerns. That Ozawa's diary from the previous night would reveal decades later his private conviction that the battle would be catastrophic defeat, but that orders left no alternative. What Vraciu didn't know was that the technology gap had become as decisive as training gap. That American radar-directed fighter control had created defensive system that positioned interceptors with precision Japanese forces couldn't match because they lacked comparable radar capability. That Japanese pilots were flying into battles where American fighters knew their exact position, altitude, and heading before visual contact. Technological advantage that transformed aerial combat from contest into controlled slaughter. What Vraciu didn't know was that 40 years later, he would meet Takeshi Maeda at Veterans Reunion and learn that his 6 kills that morning had included pilots who panicked under fire, who broke formation despite orders, who jettisoned bombs before reaching targets, who flew straight and level not from courage, but from inadequate training, leaving them unable to execute defensive maneuvers that might have saved them. That learning his victories had been against students rather than warriors would transform how he remembered the battle and would haunt him for the rest of his life. The mathematics of aerial warfare were being written in the skies over the Philippine Sea, and those mathematics were proving something Japanese leadership had refused to acknowledge, that modern aerial combat required systematic training infrastructure producing qualified pilots at rates matching or exceeding combat losses, and that once training system collapsed under sustained attrition, no amount of courage could overcome resulting disparity between experienced defenders and inexperienced attackers. By the time Vraciu's Hellcat launched at 10:39 hours as part of the 12-plane division being vectored to intercept the approaching formations, Japanese naval aviation was already doomed. The pilots approaching Task Force 58 were flying toward deaths so inevitable that even their own commanders knew the mission was futile. But orders had been given. The Emperor's will demanded decisive battle, and 450 Japanese naval aviators would die that day, proving that willpower cannot overcome systematic training failure when facing enemies who possessed both technological superiority and comprehensive aircrew preparation that transformed competent aircraft into decisive weapons, while inadequate training transformed equivalent aircraft into flying coffins. June 18, 1944, 21:30 hours. Meanwhile, aboard carrier Zuikaku, Ensign Takeshi Maeda's diary entry from the evening before battle, preserved in his family's possession and published in 1987 collection of Japanese war diaries, documented the fear and resignation that characterized Japanese naval aviation by mid-1944. The diary entry stated, according to published translation, that Maeda had attended final briefing for next morning's operation. According to the entry, Admiral Ozawa had explained that mobile fleet would engage American carriers in decisive battle. The entry recorded that briefing emphasized importance of achieving surprise and executing coordinated attacks that would overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous strikes from multiple directions. But the diary entry revealed, according to translation, that Maeda and other junior pilots recognized gap between what briefing described and what they were capable of executing. The entry stated, "The attack plan requires coordination. We have not practiced adequately. We are supposed to maintain formation through enemy fighter attacks and execute bombing runs against targets we may not be able to identify correctly." Lieutenant Hayashi, who leads our division, expressed concerns to squadron commander, but was told mission must proceed regardless of training deficiencies. The diary entry documented Maeda's assessment of his own readiness according to translation. The entry stated that he had received 6 months training including approximately 120 hours flight time. According to the entry, this was half the training time that pilots received earlier in war and 1/6 the training pre-war pilots had received. The entry noted that fuel shortages meant much of his training had been done in gliders. Ammunition shortages meant gunnery practice was limited to approximately 100 rounds total. Most significantly, the diary entry stated, according to translation, "I have never flown in combat. I have never been shot at. I do not know how I will respond when American fighters attack. Lieutenant Hayashi told us tonight that many of us will die tomorrow. He said we must accept this and focus on damaging enemy carriers before we die. He said dying while inflicting damage honors the Emperor. Dying without inflicting damage wastes our sacrifice." The diary entry concluded, according to translation, with Maeda's private thoughts about the mission. The entry stated, "I am frightened. I do not want to die tomorrow, but I cannot refuse to fly. My family would be dishonored. My father served the Emperor faithfully. I must do the same even though I know I am not adequately prepared for what tomorrow will bring." Similar diary entries and letters from other Japanese pilots, preserved in various archives and published in post-war collections, revealed that Maeda's fears were widely shared among junior pilots who recognized their training was inadequate, but flew anyway because cultural pressures and military discipline left no alternative. June 19th, 1944, 0530 hours. Takeshi Maeda's post-war testimony, given during 1953 interview preserved in Japanese Self-Defense Force archives, described the launch sequence that would send him toward the most traumatic experience of his life. According to the testimony, Maeda awoke at 0430 hours after sleeping poorly. The testimony stated he ate breakfast, rice and fish, knowing it might be his last meal. At 0500 hours, pilots assembled for final briefing, receiving specific assignments and attack vectors. Maeda's testimony described, according to archives, that he was assigned to second attack wave scheduled to launch at 0900 hours. His division of 9 aircraft, 6 dive bombers and 3 fighters would attack American carriers from high altitude, attempting to achieve surprise through cloud cover. The testimony stated that briefing made mission sound straightforward, but that Maeda and other junior pilots exchanged looks, suggesting they recognized gaps between plan and their capability to execute it. The testimony described launch sequence according to archives. At 0856 hours, Maeda's aircraft was positioned on flight deck. Deck crew performed final checks. At 0903 hours, launch officer gave signal. Maeda advanced throttle to full power. The testimony stated that his aircraft rolled down deck and lifted off successfully, though he later admitted he nearly crashed because he misjudged takeoff speed due to nervousness. Formation assembly took nearly 40 minutes according to testimony, far longer than planned. The testimony stated that pilots had difficulty finding their assigned positions. Several aircraft nearly collided during assembly. By time formation was complete and heading east toward reported American carrier positions, coordination problems were already apparent. The testimony described Maeda's thoughts during approach. According to archives, he stated, "I looked at other aircraft in formation and saw pilots who appeared as frightened as I felt. Some were very young, perhaps 18 or 19 years old like me. I wondered how many of us would survive the day. I tried to remember my training but kept thinking about how inadequate it had been. I had never practiced the kind of attack we were supposed to execute. I had never been in combat. I did not know what to do when American fighters attacked us." June 19th, 1944, 10:52 hours. Alexander Vraciu's combat report filed June 20th, 1944, preserved at National Archives, documented his 6 kills with clinical precision. But his post-war memoir published in 1991 added emotional context that revealed what the clinical language couldn't convey, that he had killed 6 pilots who couldn't defend themselves effectively. The memoir described, according to published account, that fighter director vectored his division toward large formation detected at 75 miles range. Vraciu's division of 12 Hellcats climbed to 20,000 feet, positioning above reported enemy altitude. At 10:52 hours, Vraciu made visual contact with Japanese formation approximately 10 miles ahead. The memoir's description stated, "I could see them clearly, maybe 50 aircraft total with dive bombers and fighters mixed together. But something was wrong with their formation. They were bunched up instead of properly spaced."
Their altitude discipline was terrible, aircraft scattered across several thousand feet. It looked sloppy, not like the Japanese formations I'd fought before. Vraciu's memoir described selecting targets according to published account. He spotted 6 dive bombers flying in loose formation at 16,000 feet. The memoir stated, "I approached from high stern quarter, perfect attack position, and they didn't react. No evasive maneuvering, no defensive fire, nothing. I closed to 300 yards and opened fire on the lead bomber." The memoir's description of first kill stated, 2-second burst, the bomber exploded immediately. Pieces flew everywhere. I broke right, climbed, and looked for my next target. The other 5 bombers were still flying straight and level. They hadn't reacted to seeing their leader explode. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. These pilots weren't defending themselves. The memoir described second kill according to published account. "I positioned behind another bomber, same attack geometry, same lack of defensive reaction. I fired at 250 yards. The bomber caught fire and went down. The pilot didn't bail out, just rode it down burning." Third kill description in memoir stated, "I'm starting to feel sick about this. These pilots can't fight back. They're flying straight and level while I kill them one by one. It's not combat, it's execution. But I can't stop. They're enemy aircraft heading for our carriers. I have to shoot them down regardless of how I feel about it." Fourth and fifth kills, according to memoir, happened within 2 minutes. The description stated, "Both bombers jettisoned their bombs before I fired, apparently panicking when they saw me approaching. Neither took evasive action, neither returned fire effectively. Both went down after short bursts. I'm trying not to think about the pilots inside those aircraft." Sixth kill description in memoir was most disturbing. The account stated, "Last bomber in formation, I positioned for attack. Before I fired, the pilot bailed out. He saw me coming and bailed out before I shot at him. I've never seen that before. Japanese pilots don't quit, but this one was so scared he abandoned his aircraft before I even fired. I watched him parachute down while his empty aircraft crashed into the sea." The memoir's assessment stated, 6 kills in 8 minutes, personal record. I should feel proud. Instead, I feel sick. Those weren't warriors. Those were kids sent to die by commanders who knew they weren't ready. I shot down 6 aircraft, but I'm not sure I defeated 6 pilots. They couldn't defend themselves. The war is changing. Japanese pilot quality has collapsed. What I did today wasn't aerial combat. It was slaughter. June 19th, 1944, 11:15 hours. Takeshi Maeda's 1953 testimony described what happened when American fighters intercepted his formation, providing Japanese perspective on the systematic destruction that American pilots were inflicting. According to the testimony, Maeda's formation was approaching Task Force 58 at 17,000 feet when American fighters attacked from above. The testimony stated, "We never saw them until they were firing. They came from the sun. We had no warning. Suddenly, aircraft around me were exploding." The testimony described chaos that followed according to archives. Formation disintegrated immediately. Pilots broke away attempting to escape. Several aircraft collided during panic maneuvers. Maeda stated, "I tried to remember my training about what to do when attacked, but I had never practiced this scenario adequately. My training assumed I would see enemy before they saw me, but they had surprised completely. I didn't know what to do." Maeda's testimony documented that he attempted to stay with his wingman as trained, but wingman's aircraft was hit within seconds. According to the testimony, "I saw his aircraft catch fire. He tried to bail out, but I think he was already dead when his aircraft exploded. I had known him for 3 weeks. He was 18 years old. His name was Suzuki. He died because we were sent to fight without adequate preparation. The testimony described Maeda's attempts to reach target according to archives. He stated, "I was alone. My division was destroyed. I could see American carriers below, but American fighters were everywhere. I knew if I attempted to attack, I would die. I jettisoned my bomb trying to gain speed to escape. I dove toward water, hoping American fighters wouldn't follow." Maeda's testimony stated that American fighter pursued him during dive, according to archives. The testimony described, "I could see him in my mirror. He was faster than me. He was closing. I thought I would die. I was preparing to die. Then he broke off. Maybe he ran out of ammunition. Maybe he decided I wasn't worth killing since I had already jettisoned my bomb. I don't know why he let me live, but I survived because American pilot chose not to kill me." The testimony concluded according to archives with Maeda's assessment of the battle. He stated, "I returned to carrier alone. My entire division was destroyed. Only 3 aircraft from our entire squadron returned. We had achieved nothing. We had not damaged any American ships. We had just died. Most of my friends died that day. They died because Japan sent inadequately trained pilots to fight enemies we could not defeat. After that battle, I knew Japan had lost the war."
Not because our courage failed, but because our training system had collapsed. June 19th, 1944, 1400 hours. Meanwhile, at Kasumigaura Naval Air Group Training Facility in Japan, Training Officer Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata's report, dated June 15th, 1944, preserved in archives and translated post-war, documented the training system collapse that had produced the inadequately prepared pilots dying over the Philippine Sea. The report stated, according to translation, that Kasumigaura was training pilots on accelerated schedule due to operational demands. Pre-war training required 3 years producing pilots with approximately 700 hours flight time. Current training required 6 months producing pilots with 100 to 120 hours flight time. The report documented specific deficiencies according to translation. Fuel shortages meant training flights were limited to 30-40 hours in powered aircraft, with remainder in gliders. Ammunition shortages meant gunnery practice was limited to 50-100 rounds total per pilot. Time pressure meant many training modules were abbreviated or eliminated entirely, including night flying, instrument flying, and formation tactics practice. Most significantly, the report stated, according to translation, "We are sending pilots to combat who are not adequately prepared. They have learned basic flying skills but have not mastered combat techniques. They panic under pressure because they have not been trained to handle combat stress. They cannot execute complex maneuvers because they have not practiced them sufficiently. We know they will die at higher rates than properly trained pilots, but operational demands require deploying them despite inadequate preparation." The report included plea to Naval General Staff, according to translation. "We request permission to extend training period to minimum 1 year with 300 hours flight time. Current 6-month program produces pilots who cannot survive against American forces. We are not training warriors. We are sending students to die. This is not sustainable." Naval General Staff response to Shibata's report, preserved in archives, stated, according to translation, "Request denied. Operational requirements demand maximum pilot production. Training period cannot be extended. Deploy all graduates regardless of skill level. Quality concerns are noted but are secondary to quantity requirements." June 19th, 1944, 1600 hours. By late afternoon, compiled action reports from Task Force 58 carriers preserved at National Archives documented devastation that exceeded anything in naval aviation history. Fighter squadrons reported, according to records, VF-15 from Essex, 68 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 Hellcats lost, VF-16 from Lexington, 44 enemy aircraft destroyed, 1 Hellcat lost VF-2 from Hornet, 51 enemy aircraft destroyed, 0 Hellcats lost VF-8 from Bunker Hill, 53 enemy aircraft destroyed, 1 Hellcat lost. Total American claims exceeded 300 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Additional aircraft were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire from ships. American losses totaled fewer than 30 aircraft from all causes, including operational accidents. The kill ratio, approximately 10.1 in air-to-air combat, was unprecedented according to historical analysis. Previous major carrier battles produced ratios ranging from 2.1 to 5:1. Philippine Sea was producing results suggesting not combat, but systematic execution. Pilot debriefing reports preserved in squadron records revealed consistent observations across all fighter units. Commander David McCampbell's debriefing from Air Group 15 stated, "Enemy pilot quality was markedly inferior to previous encounters. Targets flew predictable patterns. Defensive maneuvering was minimal or absent. Gunnery from enemy aircraft was sporadic and inaccurate. Multiple pilots reported enemy aircraft jettisoning ordnance before engaging targets. Assessment is that enemy training has degraded substantially." Similar assessments appeared in debriefings across task force. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia from VF-9 stated, "Shot down 6 enemy aircraft. None took effective defensive action. 1 pilot bailed out before I fired. This is not the Japanese naval aviation we fought in 1942. Something has changed fundamentally." The change was training system collapse according to intelligence assessment compiled from pilot reports. The assessment stated, "Enemy pilot quality has degraded to point where they are no longer able to execute complex coordinated attacks or defend themselves effectively against experienced interceptors." This suggests systematic training failure rather than tactical adjustment. June 19, 1944, 17:30 hours. Takeshi Maeda's testimony described returning to Zuikaku after battle, providing emotional context for statistics that documented catastrophe's human cost. According to the testimony, Maeda approached carrier at 16:45 hours. Landing signal officer guided him to successful landing, though Maeda admitted he nearly crashed due to exhaustion and stress. After landing, he counted returning aircraft according to testimony. Of 128 aircraft that had launched from Mobile Fleet's carriers that morning, fewer than 40 returned. The testimony describes scene on hangar deck according to archives. Maintenance crews waited for aircraft that would never return. Flight deck crew prepared to recover aircraft that had been destroyed. Squadron commanders compiled casualty lists of pilots who had died. Maeda's testimony stated that he reported to squadron commander for debriefing. According to the account, "Commander asked what happened. I told him formation was intercepted by American fighters before we reached targets. I told him most aircraft in my division were destroyed within minutes. I told him pilots panicked and broke formation. I told him we achieved nothing." The testimony described Commander's response according to archives. Commander stated according to Maeda's account, "You are not first to report this. Every returning pilot describes similar results. We have lost approximately 75% of our air groups. We achieved no significant damage to enemy carriers. This battle was catastrophic defeat." Maeda's testimony stated that squadron commander then said, according to archives, "I told Admiral Ozawa this morning that our pilots were not ready. I told him we needed more training before engaging American forces. He told me orders required attacking immediately regardless of readiness. Now most of my squadron is dead. Your friends are dead. They died because we sent them to fight before they were prepared." The testimony concluded with Maeda's assessment according to archives. "I understood that night that Japan had lost the war, not because our courage failed, not because our equipment was inferior, but because our training system could not produce pilots who could survive against American forces." After Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation existed but could not conduct offensive operations. We had pilots and aircraft but lacked trained crews,
who could use them effectively against competent enemy. June 20th, 1944. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's report to Combined Fleet dated June 21st, 1944, preserved in archives and translated post-war, acknowledged defeat with candor, rare in Japanese military communications. The report stated, according to translation, that Mobile Fleet had lost approximately 445 carrier aircraft during June 19th, 20 operations. This represented 75% of Mobile Fleet's total air groups. Additionally, 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, had been sunk by American submarines during withdrawal.
The report documented that pilot losses were even more catastrophic than aircraft losses, according to translation. Approximately 450 pilots had been killed, including 42 of 82 strike leaders. The report stated these losses cannot be replaced with pilots of equivalent quality given current training capacity. Most significantly, the report stated, according to translation, our failure was not primarily tactical or technological. Our failure was systematic inability to field adequately trained pilots. The pilots we deployed yesterday were brave and willing, but they lacked training to execute complex attacks or defend themselves effectively against experienced enemy fighters. We sent them to die knowing they were inadequately prepared because operational requirements demanded we commit available forces regardless of quality concerns. The report continued, according to translation, this defeat marks end of Japanese naval aviation's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations. We can defend our fleet, but cannot project power against enemy fleet protected by radar-directed fighter defense and flown by pilots whose training far exceeds our current training capacity. Recommendation is to withdraw Mobile Fleet to positions where land-based air can provide support and to reconsider operational concepts given acknowledged pilot quality deficit. August 1944. Japanese Naval General Staff Assessment dated August 15, 1944, preserved in archives, documented the logical conclusion of training system collapse, transition from conventional operations requiring skilled pilots to suicide operations requiring minimal training. The assessment stated, according to translation, that conventional carrier air operations were no longer feasible given pilot quality deficit revealed at Philippine Sea. Training system could not produce pilots capable of surviving combat against American forces. Each conventional attack resulted in disproportionate losses that accelerated training system death spiral. The assessment proposed, according to translation, what it termed special attack methods that would utilize pilot willingness to sacrifice life for Emperor while minimizing training requirements that current system cannot meet. The assessment stated, if pilot attacks conventionally, probability of success against American defenses is near zero. Inadequately trained pilot dies without inflicting damage. If same pilot conducts suicide attack, probability of hitting target increases to 30 to 40%. Pilot dies either way. Special attacks ensure death serves purpose. The assessment concluded, according to translation, recommend establishing special attack units utilizing pilots with minimal training, conducting deliberate crashes into enemy ships. This approach requires only basic flying skills and navigation training, capabilities current training system can provide in 40-50 hours. Special attacks transform pilot quality deficit into tactical advantage by substituting pilot skill with pilot willingness to die. This assessment, according to historical analysis, provided intellectual foundation for institutionalizing kamikaze tactics. Philippine Sea had proven Japanese pilots couldn't survive conventional combat. Kamikaze offered alternative that required less training while potentially inflicting more damage. The transition was pragmatic response to training system collapse rather than cultural fanaticism. October 1944. Takeshi Maeda's testimony described his October 1944 transfer to Special Attack Unit, providing personal perspective on kamikaze transition. According to the testimony, Maeda was summoned by Squadron Commander in late September. Commander explained that naval aviation was establishing special attack units. Pilots would deliberately crash aircraft into enemy ships, ensuring hits that conventional attacks could no longer achieve. Maeda's testimony stated, according to archives, that Commander asked him to volunteer. The testimony described, Commander said conventional operations had failed at Philippine Sea. He said American defenses were too strong for pilots with my level of training to penetrate successfully. He said special attacks would ensure my death served purpose rather than being wasted in unsuccessful conventional attack. He asked me to volunteer to die for Emperor. The testimony described Maeda's response according to archives. I did not want to volunteer. I did not want to die, but I understood that refusing would dishonor my family. I understood that if I flew conventional missions, I would likely die anyway without inflicting damage, as I nearly did at Philippine Sea. Commander made clear that volunteering for special attacks was only honorable choice. I volunteered. Maeda's testimony stated that he was assigned to Special Attack Unit in October 1944. Training for kamikaze missions required only 30 additional hours, focused on navigation and formation, flying to target. Combat skills were unnecessary because pilots would not defend themselves, only reach target and crash. The testimony described Maeda's thoughts during kamikaze training, according to archives. I was training to die. Every flight brought me closer to death I had volunteered for. I was not afraid exactly, I had accepted death. But I was sad that my death was necessary, because Japan could not train pilots who could fight and survive. Philippine Sea had proven our training system had failed. Kamikaze was admission that we could not produce pilots capable of conventional combat. Better to die hitting target than die before reaching it. November 1944. Takeshi Maeda's testimony included remarkable addendum explaining how he survived despite volunteering for suicide mission. According to the testimony, Maeda's kamikaze unit was scheduled to attack American carriers off Philippines in November 1944. On November 13th, Maeda's aircraft experienced engine problems during pre-flight preparation. Maintenance crew determined problem could not be fixed quickly. The testimony stated, according to archives, my flight launched without me. I watched them take off knowing they were flying to their deaths. I felt guilty that I survived because of engine problem, but I was also relieved. I was not ready to die despite volunteering. Engine failure gave me excuse to live without appearing cowardly. Maeda's testimony stated that his unit was effectively destroyed in the attack. Few aircraft successfully hit targets. Most were shot down by American fighters before reaching carriers. None of the pilots returned. According to the testimony, new orders arrived before Maeda could be assigned to another kamikaze mission. All remaining pilots were to be retained in Japan for homeland defense. Maeda was transferred to Air Defense Unit and never flew another offensive mission. The testimony concluded with Maeda's assessment according to archives. I survived because of engine problem and timing. If engine had worked, I would have died in November 1944. Instead, I survived war. Many pilots who survived Philippine Sea died as kamikazes in following months. We all died because Japan's training system collapsed. Some died in conventional combat they weren't prepared for. Others died in suicide attacks that were only viable option once conventional combat became impossible. I survived by accident. But survival did not feel like victory. It felt like witnessing tragedy that I should have died preventing, but couldn't. 1984, San Diego. The 1984 reunion of American and Japanese naval aviation veterans, documented in published proceedings, brought Alexander Vraciu and Takeshi Maeda together 40 years after battle that had shaped both their lives. According to proceedings, Vraciu, age 68, Commander USN retired, met Maeda, age 59, retired, during International Veterans Program. Their conversation, recorded in proceedings, revealed emotional complexity neither man had fully processed during intervening decades. Vraciu's statement, according to transcript, acknowledged his victory record from June 19, 1944. He stated, "I shot down 6 Japanese aircraft that day in 8 minutes. It was my best mission. I was proud of it for many years, but I never understood what I had actually done until much later." Maeda's response, recorded in transcript, provided perspective that transformed Vraciu's understanding. According to proceedings, Maeda stated, "Most pilots in formations you attacked that day had training similar to mine. 6 months preparation, 100 hours flight time, minimal combat training. We knew we were inadequately prepared.
We flew anyway because orders required it, and because refusing would dishonor families." The transcript documented Vraciu's reaction. According to proceedings, he stated, "I didn't know. Your formations looked professional from distance. By the time I engaged, I could see something was wrong, but I was in combat mode. I didn't think about your training. I just shot you down. Learning now that you were students changes everything. I thought I was fighting warriors. I was killing students." Maeda's response, according to transcript, stated, "You did what you were ordered to do. We did what we were ordered to do. Difference was your training prepared you to survive. Our training did not. That was not your failure or ours. That was our military system's failure."
They sent us to die knowing we could not succeed. The transcript documented discussion of kill ratios that shocked American veterans present. According to proceedings, Maeda stated, 10-to-1 kill ratio everyone celebrates was not testimony to American pilot skill, though you were skilled. It was testimony to Japanese training collapse. You were professionals shooting students. Of course, ratio favored you overwhelmingly. What else could it be? Vraciu's response, recorded in proceedings, acknowledged this truth. According to transcript, he stated, "Philippine Sea was not great victory. It was tragedy. We won because your training system collapsed, not because we were 10 times better than you. We were better trained. We had better technology. We had numerical superiority."
You had courage, but courage without training, and technology is just wasted life. You died proving that modern warfare requires systematic training infrastructure. Nations that can't maintain training quality under sustained attrition lose regardless of how bravely inadequately trained pilots fight. The transcript concluded with exchange that captured both men's assessment of battle's meaning. According to proceedings, Maeda stated, "Philippine Sea taught Japan that we had already lost war. After that battle, conventional naval aviation was impossible. We transitioned to kamikaze not from fanaticism, but from recognition that inadequately trained pilots could not survive conventional combat against your forces." Vraciu's response, according to transcript, stated, "Learning this makes me understand my victories differently. I'm proud we won war. I'm glad I served effectively. But I'm not proud of killing pilots who couldn't defend themselves. That's not combat. That's execution. Philippine Sea should be remembered not as great victory, but as warning about what happens when training systems collapse. The slaughter we inflicted was an inevitable result of your training failure, meeting our training success." The Great Marianas turkey shoot revealed truths about aerial warfare, training systems, and human cost of systematic failure that remain relevant for modern military aviation. First truth: technology and training both matter, but training matters more. American aircraft were superior by 1944, but not overwhelmingly. Japanese A6M-0 remained formidable in skilled hands, but inadequately trained pilots couldn't exploit any aircraft's capabilities effectively. Philippine Sea proved that well-trained pilots in adequate aircraft dominate poorly trained pilots in comparable aircraft so completely that combat becomes execution. Second truth: training systems must sustain losses or fail catastrophically. Japan began war with superbly trained pilots, but couldn't produce replacements matching combat loss rates.
Each loss required replacing experienced pilot with less experienced pilot who died faster, requiring even less experienced replacement. Death spiral accelerated until Philippine Sea produced conditions where pilots with 100 hours training faced pilots with 400 hours training plus combat experience. Outcome was predetermined. Third truth: courage cannot overcome training deficit. Japanese pilots who died at Philippine Sea were not cowards. They were brave men sent to die by a system that couldn't train them adequately. Their courage was wasted because courage without capability is just wasted life. Modern warfare requires systematic training infrastructure. Nations lacking it lose regardless of cultural values emphasizing courage or sacrifice. Fourth truth: desperation tactics emerge from training collapse, not cultural factors. Kamikaze wasn't Bushido, it was admission that training system couldn't produce pilots capable of conventional combat. When conventional operations require skill that training can't provide, military organizations adapt by reducing skill requirements through tactics substituting capability with expendability. Kamikaze was pragmatic response to training failure, not cultural fanaticism. Fifth truth: victory over inadequately trained opponents teaches wrong lessons. American pilots who achieved unprecedented kill ratios at Philippine Sea learned they could dominate Japanese aviation. True lesson was that they were fighting opponents crippled by training collapse. Victory came not from exceptional American capability, but from exceptional Japanese failure. This created dangerous overconfidence about future conflicts where opponents might be adequately trained. The 300-400 Japanese aircraft destroyed on June 19, 1944, represented more than tactical defeat. They represented culmination of training system death spiral that doomed Japanese naval aviation permanently. Pilots who died were victims of systematic failure, sent to fight battles they couldn't win by commanders who knew they were inadequately prepared but sent them anyway because orders required it. Alexander Vraciu's 6 kills in 8 minutes weren't testimony to his exceptional skill, though he was a highly skilled pilot. They were testimony to profound mismatch between well-trained, experienced pilot engaging inadequately trained, inexperienced pilots who lacked capability to defend themselves. His targets flew straight and level, not from courage, but from inadequate training, leaving them unable to execute defensive maneuvers that might have saved them. Takeshi Maeda survived when engine problems prevented him from dying as kamikaze in November 1944. His survival allowed him to provide testimony explaining Japanese perspective, that pilots knew they were inadequately trained, that they flew anyway because cultural and military pressures left no alternative, that watching friends die throughout the day taught survivors that Japan had lost war through training system collapse. The battle's name, Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, captured American perspective of easy kills against inadequately defended targets. The name feels cruel, knowing Japanese pilots were students sent to die against professionals. But cruelty wasn't in name, but in system that sent inadequately trained pilots to predictable deaths when outcome was inevitable.
40 years later, Vraciu and Maeda could meet as friends and discuss battle honestly. Vraciu learned his victories had been against students rather than warriors. Maeda explained they had flown knowing they would probably die, but flew anyway because honor demanded it. Both men understood finally that Philippine Sea proved training matters more than courage, and that systems unable to sustain training quality across sustained attrition are doomed regardless of how bravely their inadequately trained personnel fight. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was decisive not because 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day, though that was unprecedented, but because it proved Japan couldn't replace losses with pilots capable of contesting American air superiority. After June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation existed as force, but not as threat.
Training system had failed, death spiral had reached terminal velocity, and pilots continued dying at rates making eventual defeat certain. The battle that destroyed Japanese naval aviation in 15 minutes of concentrated slaughter wasn't triumph to celebrate, but tragedy to study. Tragedy that resulted when military systems sent inadequately trained pilots to die, proving that modern warfare requires systematic training infrastructure, and that systems unable to provide it lose regardless of courage or cultural commitment to sacrifice. The mathematics written in blood over Philippine Sea that day proved equation determining war's outcome. Comprehensive training multiplied by technological superiority, multiplied by industrial abundance, equals victory, more certain than courage. Multiplied by inadequate training, multiplied by cultural willingness to die. Alexander Vraciu and Takeshi Maeda both learned this truth through direct experience. One through killing 6 pilots who couldn't defend themselves. One through watching friends die because training system had failed them. Both carried that knowledge for 40 years until they could finally discuss it honestly and acknowledge that Great Marianas turkey shoot was not great victory but necessary tragedy, teaching brutal lesson about training systems and their collapse.